Welcome everyone. My name is Joanne Duklas. I will be moderating today's session, which is called Connecting the Dots Between International Initiatives and Student Data Exchange and Mobility, which is part of a series related to the ARUCC Groningen and Student Mobility Project that all of us are working on. I just want to remind everybody we will be taping this particular webinar. If you use the chat box, Matt Schultz will be monitoring it. And we will also be, if you choose to take your phone off audio to ask a question, that's fine. Just please remember to put it back on mute so that we don't have background noise. Today we're going to do a few introductions, give you a bit of an overview of the project because there's some people on the call today participating who weren't able to participate in our webinar. So we'll take a few minutes to do that. And then we're going to turn to our panel. We have some questions for them. You may have questions for them, which you can send via the chat, and hopefully we'll have enough time at the end for some discussions and additional questions, and I'll also share with you next steps for the project. Without further ado, our first presenter you may know well is our own Dr. Rob Fleming, who is the Executive Director and Co-Chair of the BC Council on Admissions and Transfer. He's one of the founding directors of the Pan-Canadian Consortium on Admissions and Transfer, a national group focused on transfer and student mobility across Canada. A good colleague, and he's also the BCCAT representative and vice chair of the Groningen and Student Mobility Steering Committee. Hello, Rob, how are you?
Hi, folks. Thanks for being here.
We also have Sir John Daniel, who was appointed as an officer of the Order of Canada. He is the former president of both Laurentian University and the UK Open University, former Assistant Director General of UNESCO, and President of the Commonwealth of Learning. Wonderful to have you on the call, Sir John.
Thank you.
We have Herman de Leeuw, who is the Executive Director of the Groningen Declaration Network. He's actually one of its founding people, and he is also someone with an extensive expertise in credential evaluation, working with the ENIC network and others. Herman, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
And we have Michael Ringuette here from Canada. He is the coordinator of the Canadian Information Centre for International Credentials. He does a lot of work internationally. He's a good colleague of ours and has been a great help to the project and has been working hard on things like bringing the Lisbon Recognition Convention to Canada. Michael, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for inviting me today.
In addition, joining myself, Joanne, I am the project consulting lead for the ARUCC Groningen and Student Mobility Project. We have my colleague, Matt Schultz, who works with me, and he will be the gentleman who's monitoring the chat line, and occasionally you'll hear his voice as he shares a question that one of you may have asked throughout the session. Matt, how are you?
I'm good. Hello, everybody. It's good to be here.
So without further ado, I'm going to start with an overview of the project. And I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of what we're hoping to do here. We have a number of steering colleagues on the call, and I invite them, if they want to go off mute at any point, to add anything that I may have missed. Please don't hesitate to do so. Our goal with this project is to create a national solution for data exchange. And we have, in fact, a steering committee, which has been a mandate that's been endorsed by the ARUCC colleagues and friends, and that was back in 2016. And that was to continue the exploration and the development of a Canadian data exchange model, to guide the development of the model, and to ensure we embedded core benefits, such as improving student service, student mobility through efficient data sharing, encouraging a national dialogue around student mobility and success, hence all the consultation we've been doing, as well as this webinar series. We wanted to also make sure that we aligned with national and international goals of other Canadian post-secondary and pathway organizations, hence some of the collaborations I'll be talking about. And with ARUCC leading, we have created a governance model, which is the National Steering Committee, to provide oversight. And as part of that, they have hired me to help them with the process, and I started in that role back in April 2017. Project principles are core to this project, And I'm presenting them to you so that you are aware that we may remain mindful of these in all the work we're doing. Absolutely important is the first one, improving student service. The second one is preserving and supporting institutional and provincial territorial diversity, autonomy, and authority. We're not intending to create something that's a mandatory solution. Rather, we're looking to advance improvements and enhancements that support student mobility and data portability, and also build on and complement existing student application and data exchange hubs, of which there are 10 in Canada supporting post-secondary. Having said that, there are not there's not a data exchange capacity in every single province and territory, and there's also variable approaches and different levels of capacities, if you will. And so as part of this project, one of our principles has been to ensure we create a national evidence-based solution, hence all the consultation, research, and the research information request that we did both nationally and across the Groningen Network to 1,400 international colleagues, because our goal is to close some gaps, both within Canada, but also in terms of connectivity with trusted international node providers around the world. We have done this as a national coalition. So ARUCC has partnered with the Pan-Canadian Consortium on Admissions and Transfers. So those representatives too sit on the steering group, and I'll introduce them to you in a moment. We've also partnered with the CanPESC Canadian User Group, which is an affiliate of the Post-Secondary Electronic Standards Council in the US. And our colleagues, Kathy and Lisa Welsman and others, Doug Holmes, for example, have been great supports to the project. We are also partnering with CUCIO, which is the National CIO Association for Universities. A similar one at the national level does not exist for colleges, but the other three groups represent both colleges, institutions, and universities. And in addition, we have college reps on our steering. For the steering committee, the ARUCC representatives include Charmaine, who is the chair, Andrew, Rita, and Romesh Valdevel from McGill University. For BCCAT, Dr. Rob Fleming, who's the vice chair, and Dr. Rob Adamowski. For CUCIO, we have Brian Stewart and Laurie McMullen, who is the executive director of CUCIO. For CanPESC, we have Lisa Welsman from Conestoga College, Kathy Van Soest from Education Planner BC, and we also were kindly appointed a regional representative for us, Jeff Adams from the University of Manitoba, who represents a province and represents a registrarial community and enrollment services community where they actually don't have a data hub in their province. So you can see that our steering committee is attempting to reflect the voices that exist across the country, and through participating in the process here with the series that we are offering, we are seeking your advice to make sure we extend that reach. We have received formal written endorsements for the project and approval from a host of organizations, institutions, and allied organizations, government or otherwise, across the country. You will see many of the councils on articulation or admissions and transfer. You'll see universities represented here, colleges represented here. We have regional associations such as ARO from the east. We have national associations and government bodies or near government bodies such as Campus Manitoba, etc. We have application centers such as APAS that are endorsing us. And we have organizations like the Canadian Bureau for International Education. Our endorsements have not stopped there. We are getting endorsements from others across Canada, but also internationally as well. So it's become quite the movement, and we are grateful to our endorsers. And if anybody on the call is interested in providing an endorsement, we absolutely welcome it. I have a template I can send you, and it would be so helpful to us. In terms of the project, we have already done the national survey and the first task force established, which led to our mandate. We moved forward with the steering committee. We've spent a good amount of time engaging in consultation and research, and are working on the business requirements. The way forward, we have a number of sessions at the ARUCC conference and the BCCAT conference and the CanHITE conference in June. and we are looking to further consult with all of you on the business requirements, and then hopefully move forward with the necessary funding outreach that we need and the RFP. The national model we're looking for is one that meets all those principles that I talked about earlier, and that it facilitates the trusted connections, data exchange, and connection point for international nodes, that is secure, permission-based, supports Canada's diversity. It does not necessarily imply an online wallet for students. We have to wait and see. It certainly is a value-added service to have something like that, but we want to wait and see in terms of the business case and the outcomes of the RFP process. So without further ado, do any of my steering colleagues want to add anything to the overview that I've provided before we turn to our panelists?
No, Joanne, I think that covers it wonderfully. Thank you so much. And thank you all for presenting here today.
Thanks, Romesh. So without further ado, I'm going to move to our panel. And the way we're going to do this, folks, is I'm going to ask the questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor for each of our colleagues to share. And I think if it's all right with Rob Fleming, I'm going to start with you, Rob, with the very first question that we've put forward here. What interesting transfer and student mobility initiatives in Canada should we be keeping in mind as we move forward with the National Data Exchange solution that offers international connectivity?
Well, I think there are many, but I guess the bigger frame I'd put around it first is that, the relationship between credit transfer in a 13 jurisdiction country like Canada, between credit transfer, data mobility, quality assurance recognition, there's a pretty tight nexus there. And I think there's many initiatives going forward on multiple fronts that we have to keep in mind because they all interrelate to each other. A couple, for instance, the work that ARUCC and BCCAT did in developing the National Transcript and Transfer Guide, that's been key in helping us move toward a little bit more alignment of standards and practices across Canada, which is vital to credit recognition and student mobility. At the BCCAT level, we've been discussing with provincial councils a way to move forward with creating interprovincial databases on credit transfer, and then from that, international. So technology isn't really our issue on that front. It's creating an environment, policy environment where we can move that forward. So certainly we think having a really high-functioning interprovincial data hub will be really helpful in terms of us moving that one forward. All of these things require a greater alignment of practices and standards for recording data. So I think for me, top of mind is having alignment between all of those initiatives.
Thanks, Rob. Michael, did you have anything you wanted to add?
So yes, so it falls greatly in terms of what Rob just said in terms of standards. So of course, at the heart of what we've been trying to do at the Canadian Information Centre for International Credentials is to try to support our institutions in trying to implement the Lisbon Recognition Convention across Canada. And so a lot of our work has been around trying to support our institutions through standards and some tools that they can use in their admission offices. And of course, we've worked over the years with many of you that are on the call today, many of your institutions. And so one of the aspects that we're going to be looking at is to try to possibly improve those tools and resources to make sure that they take into account the new digital landscape. And so there's some work to do around this. I think we should also be thinking about the global convention. So there is a project currently with UNESCO to try to draft a new global convention that would go beyond the 55 country of the Lisbon. And so this means that this new convention could potentially apply to all countries. And so CICIC has just launched this week a consultation with the admission sector across Canada. And so we've reached out to the registrars at your institutions to see if there is some sort of agreement in terms of this potential convention. And you'll notice in that survey that we've sent that the Section 3 touches on digitization aspect. And so we're trying to see how this will affect policy in terms of those legal instruments. So these are quite, I think, important to consider as you move forward with this project.
So for our other presenters on the line, I know we'll be talking about international initiatives in a moment, but is there anything from the Canadian context that you wanted to add to what, or suggest from what Michael and Rob have added? In terms of the audience, Matt, do we have any questions that or clarifications perhaps about Michael's work or anything that they would like us to probe a bit further on?
No, we do not. I thought perhaps Rob and Michael would maybe just want to quickly talk about the current capacity for international connectivity in Canada and maybe what the current landscape in terms of international data exchange exists. If they have anything to maybe say on that point.
You want to step in first, Michael?
Sure, yes.
Go ahead, Michael.
Sorry, no, Rob, you can go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I think in a nutshell, people who are more informed than me can correct me, but it's ad hoc, and so we don't have a systemic approach. There are institutions, McGill comes to mind, Romesh, that have set up exchanges with China through the National Clearinghouse and other groups perhaps, but we don't have a centralized or even provincial approach on any of these matters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of our, the earlier presentation we did last week presents a visual of some of the gaps we've learned about from across the country. And so if you're looking for a visual of that, you can get a sense from that. There's also strengths identified in that particular overview as well. And I can send that to people after the call if there's interest in that detail.
I think that would be helpful. It's also true that there are pilots going on within Canada and cross provinces around transcript exchange in particular. The exchanges between Ontario University Application Centre and Education Planner BC are one example. So I think building off of that kind of experience is helpful.
And I know NSCAT and NBCAT are about to do some of that planning as well. And we've also got Alberta, who's planning with other provinces like Saskatchewan. And I think I saw Susan Stein on the call. And then there is also ARUCC, who's done data sharing with about 11 universities across the country. So there's pieces of strong strengths there. And the connectivity internationally is fairly limited. So is there anything more you folks want to add before I head to the slide? Okay. Maybe start with our colleagues who have had lots of experience internationally. What are some of the initiatives that are critical to watch closely beyond the borders of Canada? Michael, would you like to go first on this one?
Sure. So within the NIC network, so these are this is the network that encompassed the 55 country of the Lisbon Convention. So they definitely identified that digitization was a pressing issue. They of course want to make sure that we keep in line in terms of compliance to the Lisbon Convention. And so this touches on also something that's coming up around the diploma supplement. We know that this week there is discussion in Europe at the EHEA Ministerial Conference where the diploma supplement will be discussed and potentially approved, and it would see a digitized version of that supplement. And so we'll see this discussion then come on to the 55 countries of the Lisbon Convention for also potentially approval. And so this should definitely be considered in terms of the landscape in Europe and Canada. There's also a project called DigiRec Project. This is funded by the European Commission Erasmus program. It's being launched, it was just launched a few months ago, and it encompassed many NIC centers that are trying to work on this issue and how it will affect their policies and practices. And so we are a partner on this project along with Herman on this call today. And so we're very glad to be working on this project with many NIC centers, MRECs, and also Herman from the Groningen. And I might as well add in terms of the ministerial conference that's happening this week, we expect that the ministerial statement will be adopted tomorrow, and it contains a lot of discussion around digitization. And so I think it should be definitely something that we should be looking at. And I think Herman has a lot more information around this as well.
Yes, a nice segue. Herman.
Well, actually, I think Michael already covered quite a lot. To me, the whole issue of digitization, whether we should try to promote it or not, has been a foregone conclusion for many years already. But when you ask me which international initiatives would be equally critical to watch closely, I think especially with an eye to Canada also, because of the federal structure. Of course, you need to look at what happens with my equals, Australia, New Zealand, because they had to overcome quite a few issues that might compare to what you find in Canada, with no central government body that takes responsibility of this. The next one would be, of course, what's happening in India, which is I guess India has even a bigger population than China does. Sir John might know better than I do, but the sheer scale of what is happening there right now, with the federal government having farmed out licenses to two competing organizations to develop the National Academic Database, which, by the way, does not serve the same purposes as what we're discussing here for Canada, but nevertheless, it's the ambition, it's the vision also that they have. They would be very interesting to follow. And in 2020, actually, the Groningen Declaration Network has chosen to have its annual conference in India, just because we think in 2 years from now, there might be a lot to learn from India. And the next one, I am having conversations with several German partners on the desirability of developing a system for Germany. And I think I have already told them, listen, what's happening in Canada right now, Australia, New Zealand, India, could make sense to you too, because all four of these countries, they share the same issue. We are dealing with the federal government that's not necessarily interested in taking on this issue, just like the US never did, by the way. So these, to me, would be the most important to follow. And actually, Michael added to that, of course, DigiRec, because that leads us into the sphere of not just admission and enrollment, but lifelong learning as well.
Herman, is there some, not everybody on the call will be familiar with the Groningen Network Declaration and the Groningen Network more generally. Could you give us a little bit of an overview of the Groningen?
Yeah, well, actually, the Groningen Declaration, and I have difficulty limiting myself to speaking not too much, but anyway, the Groningen Declaration started out as a initiative of the Dutch government, the National Funding Organization. We have been hosting the data on students from the age of 4 until 25, so primary, secondary, tertiary education since 1986. And it struck us, why is it that we don't make these data available to students? Because they have a right to do so. So that system is now live under the name of Diploma Register. In 2012, it went live. And at that date, I urged the Ministry of Education and the National Funding Organization to reach out to the whole world, because basically what we were about to offer then in 2012 was a learner currency, basically, a global learner currency that he could submit as proof for his achievements worldwide. So the Groningen Declaration basically seeks to involve stakeholders that share the same vision and say, we are now going through a transition to digitization becoming the new normal. We should make sure that citizens can use the student data that they have the same way that banks have been offering to our citizens for decades already. There's more to be said, but basically that's it.
Do any of our other colleagues, before I move to the next question, want to add anything or highlight anything, either that's occurring now or that occurred in the past, that you feel our colleagues should be aware of? Okay. And Matt, is there a question? I see the chat box is lighting up. Is there a question that we need to be exploring here?
Yeah, one question was if it would be possible to have links for all the initiatives that were just mentioned.
Links for all the initiatives?
Yep, and I think that would definitely be possible, and maybe we can speak about that later in the session. We talk about posting the recordings of the sessions and all of that.
Okay. So we'll move ahead to the next question then. In your opinion, how will digitization affect the policies and practices for those working in institutions and government and allied organizations? Maybe on your respective travels or based on your past experience. Sir John as a president or a former president, Rob as a former VPA, etc. What's your sense of things we need to be mindful of?
Well, I think Herman mentioned a key one. I think we're going to have to think carefully within institutional, even organizational contexts like ours, around student access and control and how to facilitate that. Many of us have not really gone very far down that path, and that's going to have a whole bunch of implications for us in terms of privacy and security. Even with another key area has to do with the data standards themselves for BCCAT in upgrading software. You know, we're also going through the process of upgrading our data standards so that it's more transferable using the PEST XML standards, for example. So they're pretty big policy and infrastructure implications for us.
Anybody else want to comment on this question before we move forward?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in here.
Okay.
So I would think that in terms of the practitioners, so the staff that are doing assessment, it will definitely change the way that they deal with credential assessment and recognition. So what we're seeing is that, of course, a lot of these policies are adopted by a council, a senate, or a board within the institution. And so this needs to be considered as we change those practices from a paper-based approach to a digital approach. And of course, institutions have heavily relied on the paper-based documents to sort of guard against fraudulent activities. And so if we try to replace that process with a digital one, we need to make sure that there is some staff training that goes on to transition to that new process.
And there's probably some work or perspective on this from the CICIC point of view, Michael, given that most of the best practice phraseology and methodology that's available as a resource or tool for assessors is based on that hand review, right?
Yeah, definitively. So a lot of the principles that are found in the quality assurance framework, so this is the main document that sorts of lays out the policy and practices. This document will need to be updated to take this into account and make sure that we remain current, of course. And so we'll be working on this with the sectors to make sure it's updated.
Does any of our panelists have any more comments on this question before I move to Matt?
Well, I just one other thought. I think there's a massive potential benefit in terms of institutions as well. As we become more digitized and the practices around interpreting, I'll use transcripts as an example, become a little bit more aligned, and people have access to seeing the kind of decisions that are made across individual schools, there's an opportunity for some greater efficiency of building off each other's knowledge and awards, whether they're for credits or credentials, rather than everybody assessing every single document on their own in isolation.
Yeah, there have been examples of stories where somebody will get a communication, somebody at an institution from an organization that, because they're not familiar with the organization, they don't know what to be doing with that documentation. And sometimes it could be in many instances, it's a very legitimate organization that serves as a source for trusted documents. So that's also the level I think we're talking about. Somebody was going to make another comment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Herman. Yes.
Yeah, if I may, in 2013 already, the Mexican board member that we had then at the Groningen Declaration Board of Directors, Guillermo Pablo Lopez Andrade from the Mexican Ministry of Education, pointed out, well, basically you're talking about a model that is not dissimilar to what we find in the financial sector. So think SWIFT, which deals with the financial transactions worldwide. Banks need to ensure that they have codes so they know who is trusted, who is not. They deal with privacy, of course. And I'm not saying that we want to give away our soul to the financial sector, to the banking sector, but it is pertinent. It's like, okay, if we talk about this human capital issue, because that is what we are talking about actually, we should know who are trusted, who are not. We should have a telephone directory. This is something that PESC has been working on. And I worked with Michael Sessa on this issue for a while, together with UNESCO. Now they're talking about the GEO code, the Global Education Organization code. So these things are necessary. If you want to make this happen, these are the principal things that you should cover. Also, in terms of verification, whom should you turn to whenever there is a doubt about a given claim that you find. So we try to address that in the context of the Groningen Declaration, where we want to build up a directory of national, provincial, government or non-government bodies that are trusted. So you would know if whenever we have an issue about the trustworthiness of any given statement, go there. These things, they matter. And there's more to be said, but I've learned to limit myself because Sir John, Michael might have other things. Please go ahead.
Yes, if I could just comment, John Daniel here. I mean, this is by no means straightforward. I remember about the same time as Herman is talking about, UNESCO is trying to get going a portal listing credible institutions around the world. I think we quickly came to the conclusion that this was not something that an intergovernmental organization could really do, because at the end of the day, individual governments will come out in support of institutions in their countries that everyone else thinks are a bit dodgy, because simply they're on their national territory. But that leaves a problem, because if you can't look to an international organization to get this kind of thing going, who do you look to? So I think it's a question that's still hanging there.
Michael,
yeah. Let me just add there that you are totally right, Sir John, and I'm critically aware of what you said. At the same time, and Michael knows that as well, actually we took the initiative as the Groningen Declaration to reach out to UNESCO, to the International Association of Universities, who runs the WHED, the World Higher Education Database, which is basically the digital version of the International Handbook of Universities. We're saying none of us has the capacity to deal with it by ourselves. But all of us subscribe to the notion that this is something critical. We should address it. And we also try to involve the ARUCC network. It could be that we can pull this off. I'm not necessarily overly optimistic, but at least I feel the urge that this is something that we should deal with. Also because, like it or not, digitization basically is something that is happening. It's there. It's not even that we have to plan, because it will come to us, and the conviction of the Groningen Declaration is you better act up in front while you can still steer developments than rather wait and sit back and see that things happen that you don't want to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd very much agree with that. I think in the end, we're going to see the emergence of some sort of non-governmental network that builds up its credibility by reviewing these things. I mean, I've heard it said that even the IAU's list has some institutions in it which not everyone will consider credible, partly because that they all depend on what the IAU's criteria for listing are. So it's a tricky problem, but I think in the end it will be solved because it's so important that we get a solution to it.
I think, Michael, you wanted to add something, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I wanted to add around practices. So there's definitely a very big potential of trying to streamline recognition practices. And this will have a huge benefit in terms of reducing the timelines. When you think about a paper-based document, you'll often wait a few weeks to sometimes a few months to get the actual document in the mail. And so when you're able to receive those documents within a few seconds digitally, it totally changes the approach. And there's also a big potential of trying to for automation of some of the decisions, because we know that we've already assessed or seen some credentials and even the name of institutions prior. And so if there's a way to try to sort of automate some of the procedures and then, of course, do a final check afterwards. So this is all linked to the automation aspect and digitization.
Yeah, I would agree, Michael, and I think that might be part of what I saw a note there from Ramesh coming in around recruitment, and I think the speed of being able to turn these applications around is really tied to a digital process. I did want to say regarding John and Herman's discussion too, that I do think it's incredibly complex but important work. When I think about the Canadian context, the conversation internationally has to engage both with Canada as a whole and with the provinces, because even within the country, the way the quality assurance groups work is in relative isolation, and the recognition of which schools or which programs are approved by which bodies is complex in and of itself. So we have difficulty communicating that across Canada at present. So I'd just be hesitant to using some default central body to speak authoritatively for Canada.
Yeah. I would like to mention to all of you the next week's session that Michael Sessa is doing on EdXchange talks about the facility that they have created as a result of work out of California. It is a directory service, and it is a source where they've piloted with about 7 organizations and created trusted exchange. So it's an important enabler to some of what we're talking about, and I'm looking forward to seeing what he has to share with you in addition to the international perspective. The other thing I would like to mention is there was a recent study which people like Ruth Blades and I believe Kathy Van Soest and others across Canada through the Campus group did distribute to the National Listserv, and it's a geocode study which is part of a broader international geocode project. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that work, it is important, and it does relate to what we're trying to do here as part of that. I know Kathy and Ruth and others are on the call. Is there anything on that front that you want to mention before I move ahead? You can take either send a chat or provide us with a link, and we'll share it with the other links we're sharing. Matt, is there any questions coming through on the chat? I see some activity there.
No, Ramesh made a remark that I believe Rob addressed, so I think we can move on to the next topic.
Okay. So what are some of the advantages and pitfalls and so on that we need to keep in mind as we proceed with the National Data Exchange solution? And I know Sir John Unett and I had some conversations about that, and others might have some thoughts. Did you want to start, Sir John, with commenting?
Well, really, only to reinforce the discussion we were having earlier, a lot boils down in the end to the credibility of the lists of institutions and so on that are involved. And I was just going to add that I mean, there is an interesting example, which, like any analogy, doesn't go too far, but there is an interesting analogy of an organization that is non-governmental and yet has acquired huge global credibility as a kind of accreditor, and that's the International Baccalaureate Organization. So that, as I say, it only takes you so far, but there are examples of non-governmental bodies that have acquired credibility by doing good work over the years in deciding that this is acceptable and this is not acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody want to add to this question in addition to what Sir John has shared? I know we've talked a little bit about it, but I'd like to make sure we don't miss anything.
Just to reinforce a couple earlier points that came up in principles, Joanne, I think keeping our focus on what we're trying to do in terms of serving students as a key principle. I think we also have to start, as we've been doing with the steering committee, on making sure we really understand what's going on in each province and or territory, so we know where the gaps are, where the opportunities are, and know the work that's taking place there, so we can build out incrementally while we try to build a solution that brings as many in as possible.
I will also add that there are two projects that we have received support for to do a bit of a deep dive in some of the larger provinces. One is BC, which BCCAT has kindly provided support for. And the other one is on Ontario, which ONCAT has provided support for, the Ontario Council on Articulation and Transfer. And so I have invited to these meetings our colleagues across the country, but also additionally focused on some of those other provinces. It's also why we're taping them, so that other provinces and territories can view these webinars after the fact. So we're trying to make best efforts, in addition to the national survey that we've already done, to make sure we're also doing deep dives. And we have a discussion framework document that I'd be happy to provide anybody on the call if they wanted a frame to help them with some local conversations about this project and about data exchange more generally. I'm going to keep moving us forward.
May I just add something that?
No problem, Herman. Go ahead.
Yeah, you know, I was educated in the 1970s. When I took my bachelor and master degree, early 1980s in the Netherlands, there was basically no question of you moving from one university to the next. Also, if you did so, you realized that you would basically crush your own career prospects to a certain extent. So I moved from Groningen to Leiden. But if at that time, and that is 40 years ago, I would have wanted to opt for a career in Groningen, they would say, sorry, you didn't start out here. But this is something we no longer see, I hope. So to me, and this is also because of my career within all these associations, the European Association for International Education, EAIE, I think internationalization, or at least giving your kids, young potential, the opportunity to live something different from what they find in their hometown is so valuable. So if you ask me, what do you see as some of the advantages to pursuing a national data exchange solution? I mean, at the scale of Canada, it might already be beneficial if you would allow people to go from Vancouver to McGill, right? I mean, and I am coming from a very centralized national government. So in the Netherlands, there's no question about these issues. I realize that in Canada, it is not the same thing. But I would assume that all of the people that are now here on this chat, they would subscribe to the notion, please give our kids, give our next generation the potential to move if they need to.
I will say, interestingly enough, on the study abroad side, only about 2 to 3% of Canadians participate, or international students participate in study abroad outside Canada. So there's a real opportunity to grow that component as well, to build on what you're saying, Herman. Any other questions from the chat or comments before we leave this section, Matt?
Yeah, we have a question from Andrew Arita. He writes, I wonder if the fact that there are already existing capacities for electronic data exchange in Canada is an advantage or a potential pitfall. On the one hand, existing infrastructure provides a roadmap. On the other hand, having a completely blank page has some advantages. What are the thoughts of our panelists on that?
Who would like to take that first one?
Well, I'll offer a comment. It's our reality. So I think, yes, if you're designing something absolutely from scratch, perhaps it's a little easier to get everybody to line up around the same approach. But it's just not the reality we have here. And the provinces and their approach to post-secondary education are not the same. So I think we have to work with what we've got.
Any other comments? Okay, I'm going to keep us moving forward. Do any of you on the panel have any suggestions for all of us as we work to achieve a national student data exchange solution? You've given us a number of food for thought throughout today, but I thought I would ask this again.
Maybe I can jump in on this one.
Yeah.
So it's been mentioned a few times, I think the collaborative approach is quite important, and I think it's going beyond the sector. I know that Herman mentioned the banking sector, but we also need to think about the end user, such as professional regulatory bodies. They are going to be the one that are going to be looking at these credentials and receiving them digitally. So we also have to think about all the ecosphere, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments?
Yes, I certainly subscribe to that, and this is also we have been striving to be as inclusive as possible in the Groningen Declaration to create an ecosystem where you find all the stakeholders that have an interest in getting access to data. And I know that ARUCC, BCCAT could show you might start out on the issue of admission and enrollment, which is basically straightforward enough, a bachelor, master, but we transcend that that circle. We think these data are there to stay. People will need to re-educate to stay in touch with the innovations in their profession. So having a national student data exchange solution would be the first step. But to me, logically, it necessarily leads to the next step where you would have these data available for the citizens during their lifetime for academic and professional purposes.
The whole work with the refugee passport efforts in Europe are quite intriguing along those lines. So it brings that to mind for me, Herman, when you mentioned that as well, where they lose all their data. And so that, I think, is something that is going to be presented at our frontline counters, if not now, certainly into the future at some point. So we may want to add that, Matt, to the links of information that we send our colleagues as we go forward. Any other comments as I move us forward? Okay. How might, and this is really kind of a call to action for all of you on the call, we're hoping through these webinar series that we provide you with enough information that you can continue to share locally with your institutions or organizations as we work together to share about the project. But I wonder, you know, Sir John, you've been a president. You've lived in that reality, and Rob, you've been a VPA. It's always so challenging in working in large organizations to move the needle, if you will, and focus on these kinds of things and prioritize. Do you have any suggestions for our audience as to how they might help us as we work forward with this solution?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think fundamentally, as a steering committee member, too, we just need to know what the needs of individual schools are and what their limitations are, so that we can help to address them. So I know we've been doing a lot of consultation, but it's getting at that understanding that will help us the most.
Sir John, do you have any suggestions on this one?
Yeah, I remember, I mean, 30, 40 years ago, I was writing papers on creation of consortia across Canada to do various things in distance education and so on. There's some quite interesting background on that as to what works when institutions are working together. But I do think this one has a sort of rather different dynamic, because if one can really get some momentum going, then it becomes quite a serious problem for an institution not to be part of it. So I think the challenge is to create a sort of feeling around this development that it is A, inevitable, and B, is being done in a properly, in a way that shows integrity and so on, so that people want in and don't sort of create obstacles in the path of it. That sounds rather naive, but I think there's some truth in it.
So I think there are also bodies locally or provincially that institutions can ensure their network into. In BC, for example, the BC Registrars Association, or our organization, BCCAT, to be fully involved with these groups who are working with similar groups across Canada and nationally on a project like this is really helpful. It helps to strengthen the understanding and the trust that's necessary to move forward.
And Michael, is there anything, I mean, you've been doing a lot of work with regulatory bodies and schools and so on in terms of the assessor tools and so on. Is there anything, any learnings from that kind of work you've been doing that might help our colleagues as they spread the word about this project and talk about it locally within their institutions and help us get the support we need to move forward?
Yeah, I guess I return back to the collaborative approach again, because I think it's quite important to make sure there is support from a wide variety of institutions and sectors. And so I think there's a need even within the institution to make sure that different departments are aware and are in support of this. For example, the international unit and the admission office are sometimes not within the same structure, and so they need to talk, of course, because it's closely linked to the, of course, the attraction of an international student strategy in trying to find students from abroad, and also those that are going abroad that will be using this system. So,
and this project affects both domestic students and international students, both crossing borders within provinces and territories, but also outside. And so on.
May I add something then?
Absolutely.
I think the business case should also be quite clear. It's like, and with due respect to Sir John, the digitization is not something that we should market as being inevitable, because that might raise objections and what you call resistance. But we say this comes naturally. And then the second thing would be, as I talked to some of my German interlocutors this afternoon about the digitization, they said, well, you know, I think we can already say that Germany loses out on the number of foreign students that come to Germany, because the Netherlands and Norway, Sweden, and France in the near future, they're going to accommodate admission digitally. So whereas we still have students coming from China sending paperwork to Berlin or wherever in Germany, with the processing time of 3 months, they have already enrolled in the Netherlands, so we lose out there. But that concerns what you call at the start of the academic career, but also at the end of the academic career. In the Netherlands, for a doctor of medicine, in order to be able to practice, he has to apply for the license, which is not what you call given automatically with a degree. He has to submit the paperwork. Even in the Netherlands, until today, that happens. So we figured out actually the paperwork processing costs each individual graduate 3 months of salary, simply because of the administrative hurdles. If we could do this digitally, you would give your graduates 3 additional months of income. these are selling points. I think it really matters to make people understand we're not just talking digitization for the sake of it, but it actually gives tangible advantages to the institutions, to the students, to employers. That's it.
Thanks, Herman. So any further thoughts any of you would like to share with our colleagues that you haven't already shared? Hearing none.
I have a few questions.
Okay, sounds good.
So the first question regarding the ARUCC Groningen project and the business case that was just being discussed. One of the questions we have is, do we have an approximate timeline for when institutions will be contacted to contribute to the business requirements for this project? Any information you can provide that will allow institutions to internally plan for such an initiative would be very helpful. I don't know, Rob or Joanne, maybe you'll want to spearhead that one.
Joanne, you're probably the most on top of this. Maybe you can speak to it.
Okay, so we do have one of our sessions right before the ARUCC conference that's about business requirements, and we're hoping to have a lively discussion, an initial discussion with all of you. We are also creating a document that we can then share with all of you so that you can also reflect further and provide insights. In addition, at the ARUCC and BCCAT conferences, there will be sessions that are being held where some will be overview because we have to introduce people to the topic, but we're also hoping to have a couple of sessions, one in each conference at least, or a piece of a session if that's possible, where we talk further with you about what your needs are. You'll recall I also mentioned the BCCAT and the ONCAT project, and I talked about the discussion framework document. It has questions in it that talk about some of those things. All this to continue informing development of the business requirements that will shape an RFP going forward. So it's a bit of an iterative process, but in terms of a document that's an initial draft, we're hoping to get that to you fairly soon, ideally in advance of the conference. But at minimum, we do have our June session that we're planning. So I'll talk you through, I'll show you those dates in a second. Is there another question there, Matt?
Yes, I have two more questions quickly. For Herman, how can my organization or institution become a signatory of the Groningen Declaration? What is required of Groningen Declaration signatories, and what benefits do the signatories enjoy?
Yeah, well, you just contact me, but also on the website, on the horizontal line on the far right, there is a link, join us. And I don't have the website open at this moment, but you can basically look at becoming a signatory. That's one of the subheaders over there. And we try to point out, well, you know, we basically have this procedure where we have to vet the organization. Higher education institutions in general would be admitted without further questions because you serve a public goal. And like Joanne knows, we would like to make this even more digital. This might be coming up soon enough, but please, refer to the website. I can share the link with you if you don't find it after this discussion, no problem.
So Matt, I was just going to suggest we are at the 1 o'clock mark. So for the second question, perhaps we can get that and respond to it through email follow-up, if that is okay.
Sure.
So what I did want to let people know that we do have some deliverables remaining in terms of the steering mandated expectations. And so you've talked a little bit about the business requirements. They are in progress, and we're looking to validate that with all of you as well as continue to build them. And then after the conference, we're hoping to move forward with the RFP and establish an implementation foundation. So I think the conversations during the different conferences in June will be very important. and you'll hear more from the various steering members at that point, as well as myself. I'm asking that everybody watch out for that June 5th session. That is the one where we'll be talking about that Ed Exchange, that directory service provider, when you talk about trusted sources. We also have a session coming up about the Australian model that Herman mentioned, and we're also going to include in that, the CEO of Digitary is going to do an overview of models typically used for inter-institutional data exchange or data exchange with hubs, etc., which I think will be very useful. These are both sessions that some of us have seen at the Groningen meeting over in Europe, but we thought we would make sure we share that with you. The third one is the one I mentioned already about exploring initially the business requirements, and that'll be led by Charmaine and Ramesh, in addition to the conference sessions. I'm already booking sessions for after the conference with MREX and with Erasmus Without Borders, and probably we'll do a few more related to business requirements to keep all of you involved, and we'll be looking for active input as we go forward. Right now, we're kind of giving you an overview of things to think about. Here is our website and my contact details. We are going to follow up on the requests raised about links. And I also took note of Michael's comment about the professional regulatory bodies and the importance of clarity in our business case. If you have any further questions, please, or suggestions, please don't hesitate. We are actively listening. And I want to thank our panelists today for sharing their expertise and advice and guidance. We really appreciate this as we're moving forward. And without further ado, we will close off today's session. As I mentioned before, it is taped, so we will be putting it up on the session website for people. And I'll be following up with an evaluation link, because for each of these sessions, we want to make sure we're continuously improving. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.